George Washington Carver was born into slavery in Diamond Grove, Missouri, near the end of the American Civil War, which was fought from 1861 to 1865. George was black. His owners, Moses and Susan Carver, were white. Moses and Susan were German immigrants. They didn't like slavery, but they had a 240-acre farm that needed much work, and Missouri had entered the Union in 1820 as a slave state. In 1855, the Carvers purchased a 13-year-old slave girl named Mary. They treated Mary well and were happy for her when she gave birth to a son named Jim in 1859. Several years later, George was born. No one knows exactly when George was born because most records among slave owners were poorly kept. Most likely George was born in 1864. His father, Giles, was a slave who was owned by a neighbor of the Carvers. He was killed in a farming accident not long after George's birth. No one knows exactly how many brothers or sisters George had. George lived with Mary and Jim in a small cabin on the Carver farm. The cabin was the original house on the farm. Moses and Susan had since built a larger house, and they lived in that one. One night when George was still an infant, he was asleep in the cabin. Suddenly there was a sound of men on horseback. Moses knew what that meant. Twice before his farm had been attacked by raiders, called bushwhackers, who were fighting on the Confederate Southern side in the Civil War. Missouri's role in the Civil War was complicated. Even though Missouri was a slave state, many of the people who lived there were against slavery. So some of the men on the Union, northern side, fought for Missouri to remain as one of the United States and to free the slaves. But some of Missouri's men fought to create a separate nation that would keep slavery legal. They were on the Confederate side. Moses was caught in the middle. He had slaves, but since he also wanted slavery to be illegal, he upset people on both sides. The bushwhackers wanted to take the slaves and sell them in a nearby state, such as Arkansas. Moses raced to the cabin and called out for Mary. Moses grabbed Jim, and Mary grabbed George. Moses and Jim escaped, but it was too late for Mary and George. The men grabbed her and her baby, and they galloped away into the night. The next day, Moses hurried to Neosho, Missouri, which was about 8 miles away. There was a man in Neosho who was a scout for the Union side. The man might know where to look for Mary and George. Several days later, the scout came back. He was clutching George, who was very sick with whooping cough, but alive. There was no sign of Mary. The raiders had abandoned George. Mary was never heard from again. Jim and George were left without a father or a mother, but Moses and Susan were determined to give the boys a family. The Carvers moved Jim and George into the main house and treated them as if they were their own children. Even though the 13th Amendment freed all slaves in 1865, the boys stayed with the Carvers, whom they called Uncle Moses and Aunt Susan. George was simply known as Carver's George. The end of slavery. President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was a big moment in U.S. history. The proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863. It declared that the slaves in the 10 states fighting on the Confederate Southern side in the Civil War were free. Technically, the Emancipation Proclamation had little effect. The Confederate states had tried to leave the Union and weren't about to honor anything Lincoln said. But it was very important because it made clear that the Civil War wasn't just about saving the Union, but also was about ending slavery. When the Union, northern side, won the war, slavery was over everywhere in the United States. It became official when the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution took effect on December 6, 1865.